Sorry, Kevin. Okay, so as I
Good
said,
morning. Good morning. Good morning.
hi, good morning. Hi, Ellen. Okay, now,
Hi.
nice to see you. Nice to see faces on screen. Thank you for joining us.
Could you move one step to your right? It's much, oh, there you go.
Is that better? Okay, great.
Yes, the sound
I
is
know
better.
you see me in your mind's eye.
What happened? When?
I
Okay,
know you see me in your mind's eye.
I do, absolutely.
Thank you.
So I'll start again with the introduction now that we've welcomed the people on Zoom and a few more people have come in. Nice to see familiar faces, of course, at the beginning of the year and new faces. Sure. So as I said, this really is going to be a class looking at Talmudic personalities through texts in Midrash and Talmud, right? Those are the source material we're going to be using. And what, I mentioned that I'm going to be using Benny Lau's book as my own source material. I've long wanted to go through it, but unless you have an excuse, I don't really have time to sit down. And now that I'm using it as a teacher, right, as a resource for my teaching, it's much more, there's time for that. And so it's been wonderful to kind of delve into that. And so week by week, I'm not gonna use all of his personalities. That's the discretion I have as a teacher, choosing and then presenting the material, because I think like Midrash, some of you have been with me for many years, you've studied Midrash with me.
Because that thing about the shidduch really hurt me.
I need guys to mute themselves on screen. Sorry, the students here are quietly listening, and when you guys talk, we hear you. Like Midrash, rabbinic stories are often overly simplified and taken at face value. And that really denudes them of the depth and the intention that the text gives to the story, the richness that comes out of the words of the presentation of the story. And too often readers, especially to their students today, well, did this happen? Now, we've been, I would say the word is negatively affected by the discipline we'll call history. The negative affectation is that the negative impact is if something isn't historically true, we tend to be dismissive. Well, then it must not be true. The whole thing can't be true. I want us to disabuse ourselves of that notion. Chazal did not tell their stories using the historical criteria that modern historical discipline requires. Chazal were telling stories using the culture, the language, the materials, sometimes the stories they're aware of from other cultures and other disciplines, in order to enrich their own stories with educational messages that we are going to take with us. So I'm already going to say this is not a lesson in history through the text. I will give a historical background as to when certain texts were written and certain people lived, so we can fully understand the period of time in which the text is being written. But we're not here to learn, well, did Rabbi Akiva do this or say this or so this? I'll even say, and I'm sure this happens to you, when I tell a story, I often embellish it. I come home and I tell my husband something that happened, and sometimes he'll pause to say, wait, did that happen? And I'm like, oh no, I actually added that, right? I added it because as I'm telling the story, I realize like I'm excited, and in my mind, certain things have happened, but they haven't really happened. And when he pushes me, I'm like, oh no, that comment didn't happen, but it was the spirit of the comment, right? Like the spirit happened. We all do that. In other words, when my grandfather would tell stories about the poverty of his childhood, he might say something to the fact we had no bread to eat, but that doesn't mean there weren't potatoes, right? Thank God they didn't starve. They had very simple food. They had minimal food. There really was poverty in terms of the amount of clothes, the abundance he lived with in his later years, right? And, as a rabbi, it wasn't that he was wealthy, but thank God he had, compared to a childhood in which there was very little. But that statement of we had no bread to eat suggests there was no food, right? And so when a listener hears that story, that's the perception. And so storytellers often to emphasize or exaggerate a point so that listeners will remember, right, will do just that. And if you would say to them, well, how could you say that if it didn't really happen, right? I think Chazal would look at you a little perplexed or a little confused. The rabbinic storytelling genre is often oral, right? You're telling stories so that people will remember the psukim that are quoted in the story, right? Maybe some of the more exaggerated details of the story so that you want to tell them further. And I believe, I mean, throughout the year, we're going to be looking at rabbinic stories, but I believe that all of our texts essentially have stories to tell. And this summer, I'm going to be running a seminar, not here at Pardes, right, at a different institution, where the theme is storytelling. How do we tell our stories? How do our texts tell our stories? And the reason I'm mentioning it is because this year is going to be about rabbinic storytelling. And we're going to see that some of the stories are very familiar. Some of the stories you're going to want to tell over at your Shabbat table. And some of them are going to be uncomfortable because a good story is sometimes very uncomfortable or a little frightening. Or again, some of the details are exaggerated for effect. And we're going to try to understand what the stories are trying to tell us. Okay, so any questions? I'm still waiting for my source sheet. I didn't even bring my own source sheet because Pardes is really good. Matana is usually very good about this. But I will, any questions before I introduce the first character? Yes?
Do you know if we're gonna always be here?
No, we probably will not always be here. It looks like I will probably be upstairs. But they don't know yet. What she told me when I came in is this is a very big room for not that many people. Thank God we have students online. I think it was more the space they had today as they're figuring out classrooms. You will be kept posted. So what I'm going to do again, the sources aren't here, but what?
I was really surprised. I'm glad that I took the time to look at the list.
Yes. I'm guessing some people are going upstairs automatically. It was announced.
When I announced it, I was already gone.
Yeah, doesn't really matter. Yeah. So let me now start off with a little bit of an introduction where we're going to open up. We're going to be opening up with Shimon HaTzadik. We're going to be looking at a few of the sages who appear in Pirkei Avot. Pirkei Avot is very dear to me. I learn it every year with a group of women in my backyard from Pesach. Actually, we kept it going. This is the last Shabbat because the clocks are changing, where we keep going over it. We finished it a number of times. And Pirkei Avot is challenging and frustrating and infuriating and inspiring and all of those things, because a lot of the statements are very jarring to us. But we're going to be opening up with Shimon HaTzadik. And I want to talk a little bit about who Shimon HaTzadik was and when he lived, because that's going to be important for us getting to know the period of time of Bayit Sheni, what's happening in Bayit Sheni, and what Chazal are preparing for. I was listening to Dr. Malka Simkovich. She's Dr. Yael Ziegler's sister. She teaches in Chicago, and her period is Second Temple literature. And, this idea that, the Mishnah suddenly appeared out of nowhere in a vacuum, right? Where did it come from? Is just wrong. In other words, already at the beginning of the Bayit Sheni period, we see that Chazal are aware, the early sages are aware that this is going to be a finite period of time that we're going to have a temple. The era of the Mikdash and Korbanot is coming to an end, and the preparation for what it's going to look like in the aftermath after Chorban Bayit is already in place for hundreds of years before the Mishnah is written down. And really, it's a transition. When we talk about Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, we're talking about 400 BCE to around 300 BCE, 100 years within the, kind of after the Beit HaMikdash has been formed, has been rebuilt, nowhere near the end is 70 CE. A period of time where there's a transition away from Nivuah. We're already going to be at the end of the period of Nivuah. Something that's interested in Pirkei Avot, you don't have Kohanim. Shimon HaTzadik is a Kohen, but he's not named as a Kohen. And a lot of the transition or transmission of Torah, Moshe Kibel Torah Sinai, Untanua Yoshua, Yoshua l'Skenim, Skenim la'anshe Knesset Hagdolah. Who's missing? The Kohanim. The Kohanim are very much missing, and that's deliberate. In other words, there's already an awareness that the period of the Kohanim as spiritual leaders, as much as we value them and we look up to them, was not a success. Unfortunately, the Kohanim became a corrupt leadership, And so the idea of Zkenim to Chachamim to Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, the idea that there will be Kohanim who are Chachamim. Shimon HaTzadik is a Kohen, right? There are Kohanim. Rabbi Yossi is a Kohen. There are Kohanim. Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkinus is a Kohen. There are Kohanim, but you cannot have an entire communal leadership based on the Kuhuna. It did not work. And so the question of transmitting the Torah, what is it going to look like after Korban Bayit when there are no Korbanot, is already being put into place. Anyone remember what are some of the things Anshe Knesset Hagdolah are most remembered for? Remember? The calendar and the idea of setting up this idea of more Torah scrolls, Sifrei Torah, Tefillin. Again, Tefillin of course exists, mezuzot. The idea that every home should have a mezuzah, every man should be wearing Tefillin. The Sifrei Torah, there should be Sifrei Torah spread around. Havdalah, Birkat Hamazon, right? Pieces of this exist already in Torah, but the idea of turning it into something more uniform, standardized, something that's about Torah at the core, not Korbanot. Now, it's a little jarring because, wasn't Torah always at the core? No, the Korbanot were at the core. Korban, right? Lahakriv, Avodah, right? The center of our worship was really in the Beit HaMikdash for hundreds and really 1,000 years. And the transition towards something that's going to be in every household, in every community, that's where the worship is going to be centered, is a transitional process that's going to take hundreds of years to put into place. And that's really what the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah begin to do. Also, again, this is sometimes hard for us to hear. We idealize earlier generations, but there was gross assimilation and abandonment of Torah. We know this from Ezra and Nechema, right? When they come back from Sion, if we really learn Tanakh, if we really learn Tanakh, we know that Melachim was not an ideal spiritual time. There's a lot of idolatry, a lot of abandonment of Torah. I always, Chizkiyahu had discovered Sefer Dvarim, and you're like, well, what were they doing without Sefer Dvarim? It's like it has more mitzvot than any other book in the Torah. And so they renew the study of Torah throughout the nation, right? Not just Kohanim, everyone can study Torah. That's an enormous shift. And they begin really confronting the assimilation, the estrangement from Torah, the terrible poverty, the banality of lives, like lives have no structure. I'm going to say Kiviyachol, but it's similar. When you read about early Chassidut, you read about the emergence of Chassidut, and I'm not a scholar of Chassidut, so I'm saying this with humility, tremendous humility. But Chassidut was really born out of a period of terrible darkness, of poverty, of anti-Semitism, and so on. And the idea of reconnecting, people were estranged, and this idea of creating a more spiritual core to practice, right? Singing and dancing and the davening that went on, right, was really. It's not that Judaism didn't exist in the Litvak community, that there wasn't already prayer and Torah study and so on, but there was a lack of some sort of spiritual light, spiritual core. That's what's happening during Bayit Sheni with the Beit HaMikdash, right? The second temple was not as anchored. We know that as the first temple. By the way, the first temple had the split of Yehuda and Yisrael. It's not like it was this ideal utopia where everyone, it was also a very difficult time, a complicated time. And I have tremendous awe and respect for the work that goes into this transitional period of time, that they recognize, right, that at the end the prophecy is going to end, Mikdash is going to end, Korbanot are going to end. We are not ended, right? We have a Torah that allows us to be inspired by so many of the mitzvot, so much of the learning, tefillah, and so on, and that has to be brought into the home, right? Into the home, into the community. Beit Knesset, Beit Midrash, Beit Mikdash, right? We're losing, but we're not really losing. Meaning, if anything, we're gaining something that could be more democratic, right? More pervasive from Sfat all the way down, from Dan to Beersheba, right? Something that's not about one central space. It's something that's meant to touch and connect all of us. And that's really the process that we're going to be delving into through the stories.
This begins with from 400 to 300 BCE.
Anshe Knesset Hagdolah begin a process of transition that begins to create something more uniform around study of Torah, tefillah, and so on. Yes,
And
it seems to be.
were That was when tefillin started? or-
Tefillin are in the Torah, but the question of how to wear tefillin, what to wear, to begin the process of defining what, look, Vayu l'totafot b'nei Nechem, right? What were they wearing? How are they wearing it? The question of, it could be that we know even Rashi and Tosfot, Rabbeinu Tam disagree about the size of the tefillin. They began creating something that has more structure and definition, right? In terms of mitzvot. Mitzvot are in the Torah, they're not making it up. But the question of how do you write the tefillin, right? No, we don't have anything in the Tanakh that illustrates what does it look like, right? Oh, put on totafot b'nei nechem. We assume there's an oral tradition. What they understand is there's too much illiteracy. It's not enough to have an oral tradition held by, let's say, the Kohanim, right? We have to create something broader, stronger, more grounded. That's what they're doing. They're not inventing tefillin, but it seems like they're beginning the
No,
process.
It's a question is that they haven't found.
They found tefillin from Bayit Sheni. They found tefillin down by the Dead Sea.
Yeah,
Uh,
that's it, but that was,
No, but those were Jews. I mean, those.
no,
were-
that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that was later.
Later, yes.
That
We
was-
don't have much archaeological evidence from that period of time, which is why the stories we're going to read about in even today, Shimon HaTzadik, are essentially going to be the traditions that are left about that period of time. Pirkei Avot has a number of those traditions, right? We only have the written traditions, which were written hundreds of years later, but that look back on, oh, this is what Anshe Knesset Hagdolah left for us. So I can't historically prove it based on archaeology or historical texts from that time, but I will say the power of the oral tradition is preserving, right, the earlier traditions. And it seems consistently they're credited with the same things.
And Shimon HaTzadik was exactly.
He is the last generation of the Anshe. He is the end of the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah. He is the bridge. He's a Kohen. There's still a Beit HaMikdash. He's one of the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, and he's at the very end. And that's why the text about that's. I don't know what happened. Okay, at this point, Margie, can you go check? Yeah, I've done 15 minutes of an introduction without source sheets, which I think is admirable. The truth is, I have it on my phone. I can actually open up the first sheet and we'll do a little oral traditioning. But you had a question.
Not even a question, it's a problem I have it always with me, inside me, is the idea that it couldn't work oral tradition if it's not somehow consolidated with prayer and tefillah and what the Anshe Knesset did. It didn't make,
Yeah.
so we're always, sounds terrible. Everything, the Beit HaMikdash, Goldman. But it wasn't enough.
It wasn't.
So.
You see it already with, I mean, again, Ezra and Nechemiah.
How did it become? Why didn't it start early? I suppose is what I'm trying to say, because it has to be based on Torah and not on korbanot. So
Right.
I
It starts with Ezra and Nechemiah. I do want to say that. I think it starts even earlier. Again, I wanted to start more Chazali. You see Ezra and Nehemiah start defining what it was, Sukkot, Rosh Hashanah, right? You see a process of gathering and informing
So
and
what happened
defining.
with that? I went to a whole series of lectures with Rabbeinu Tam.
Yeah.
But what happened? They didn't have korbanot and they didn't have.
What do they do? So what do? They learn Torah. They build centers of Torah
That's
study.
That was almost like a.
That they start learning, right? Even from Al Naharot Babel, there was an exhibit, which some of you may have gone to
Yes.
in the Bible Lands Museum. I think they still have some of the material there. That Al Naharot Babel has showed that if you read some of even the documents, it's early, like I recognize Mishnah from Baba Kama, Baba Metzia in the documents. Like these are documents of business, of merchandise, and so on. I'm like, oh, that's already
It's
happening
already-
in Babel pre Mishnaic era. That's the Second Temple era. They're learning Torah. They're interpreting, they're passing on, and so on. And so there really is this chain of tradition that has started from Sinai. I don't want to suggest it didn't, but the question is who's holding on to the chain of tradition? Who's disseminating it? And if it were the Kohanim, which it likely was, they are not doing an ideal job. They are not managing to reach the illiterate poor people up in the north and down in the south. They're not, yeah. So that seems to be when I fill that gap in. And there is a gap we cannot fully fill of what it by Rishon, by Cheni, Yehuda, Yisrael. Like there are things we can't fully fill in. we can begin filling in from Ezra, Anshe Knesset Hagdola. And today's shiurim are in memory of Mindel Rezel Bat Gershon Vitzvia by Morena Sternfeld. Thank you. And may our learning be an aliyah for her neshama. And it always moves me when I teach, especially when I teach stories, to remember someone through a yort site, because really that's what we do. We tell stories about those who are no longer with us. It's how we remember them. And sometimes we exaggerate those stories a little bit. And often we focus, right, on the positive of that person, rightfully so, right? But you can never get the whole of the person once you choose what you want, the funny stories, the meaningful stories, and so on.
So
Yes.
one of the funny stories about Lena is that she would get up at the beginning of the class.
very
and wave the phone around to tell people to turn the
Leave
phone
him to
off.
be.
Yes,
so
please.
the
Very
small-
appropriate.
No, but you don't have to say this, because I thought it was,
Yeah.
it was a lady who was next to me, I happen to know her too. As Yael was talking about Myrna, and she's demonstrating it, Myrna said just.
And someone's phone rang.
Oh, this was Myrna?
Yes.
Okay, so I do know, of course, I can see her also, thank you. I got it as Morena.
No,
It just shows, you're right,
Say that today. She read something that the daughter had.
I've written, oh, got it.
And the last thing the daughter wrote
Wow.
was
Of course I knew Morena.
turning off your phone, and this woman's phone was like, hello, Myrna.
Yeah, we know you're there, beautiful. Oh, wow, okay, so it's even more meaningful because I didn't know, yeah, I see, just shows, well, sometimes when you see something written in Hebrew, you don't know how to read it. Okay, so do you need one of these also? Is there an extra source sheet up there?
I can go back and put on, I finally found.
Yeah,
it on
thank
my-
you, Mark.
I found it on my phone. I can go back to my phone and do it. Okay. Yeah,
Okay, so let's pick up Shemona Kudi. So we have a lot to do, and look, hold on to these, please. I don't want to have to reprint them. If you're coming back next week, please bring them. We're not going to get as, through all the sources. Shimona Tzadik Hayam Mishayarei Knesset Agdola. So we have this in Pirkei Avot. Pirkei Avot is really a very important series of Mishnah, not just because we learn it between Pesach and Shavuot, but because really a lot of the sages are not widely known throughout the Talmud. A lot of them are singular. I mean, they're mentioned once in Pirkei Avot, and then maybe you'll find them one other time in the Talmud. They open up a world to a very wide network of sages. And really, I would say the religious philosophy that's guiding them, it's a little like Proverbs, right? It's a little like Mishlei in terms of giving good advice for how you can live a moral, ethical life. As I said, some of the suggestions are infuriating.
Yeah.
I'll turn best right? Don't spend too much time speaking to women. Okay, but what did he used to say? So here he is. Hu haya omer al shlosha dvarim ha'olam omed ala Torah. No, we say this and we might even sing it if we're children in Reshit, which is where my children learn, right? But I want to look at the order in which he says what he says. Ala Torah. So remember, Anshe Knesset Agdola, they are creating a much more wide, stable, mainstream platform for Torah and Torah study. And so he says that's one of the three. That's going to be eternal. Here we are in 2022, learning Torah in memory of Myrna, right? And here we are, women learning Torah. And we are still learning Torah thanks to the efforts and the networks that were set up in the time of Anshe Knesset Agdola. And then he throws in the Avodah. And he ends with Gemilut Chasadim. And I want to say there's brilliance in this. Remember, he's a Kohen still living during Bayit Sheni. Avodah is still very important. He's not going to dismiss or ignore or erase Avodah, but he puts it in the middle. He doesn't start with it. He doesn't end with it. And I think, again, order matters. The middle says, yes, there's centrality here. There's importance here. But you know what? I don't want to make it first because that gives it too much importance. I don't want to make it last because often, again, the last thing has a lot of importance. It's in the middle and it's buttressed by Torah and Gemilut Chasadim. And if we take out Avodah, we're okay. The triangle, right? We still have the two pillars on the ends, the first and the third that are holding us up. The third is going to fall. It's going to drop out, but we're still going to be holding up the world with Torah and Gemilut Chasadim. I also think ending with Gemilut Chasadim to me is very moving. I bring that right. It gives, I think, a little more emphasis on the Gemilut Chasadim. Torah or Torah study may not be accessible to everyone. everyone can be Gemilut Chesed. We are created, hold on 1 second, to be on Sheikh Chesed, something I taught today, this week a few times as a midrash. I've talked to some of you, the question of why create man, Adam, not Jews, Adam, human beings, because we do Chesed. God desires a creature, a creation that can do acts of chesed. And so I find it particularly moving that he ends with Gemilut Chesedim, because essentially he's inviting all of us in. Here we are thousands of years later and saying, okay, Torah, yes, we're learning Torah. You can all do chesed all the time. Yeah.
Excuse me, Nechama, when you
No,
move to, when you move to the side, we can't see you.
I'm going to stay here. Okay.
Thank you.
Are you not seeing Avodah read in?
I'm going to get to that. Yes, I'm going to get to that. Thank you. It is clear, beautiful play, because what's happening with Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, avoda is going to be the word to use for Shmoneh Esrei. Yeah, exactly. The avoda Yom Kippurim, which we just, not long ago read. The avoda, that avoda is going to drop out. Thank you. Even more, his order is brilliant because the Torah and the avoda is going to shift from being korbanot to tefillah. Beautiful, right? We're still going to do avoda. So that's Shimon Tzadik. Let's take a look at, anyone else have a question? I want to get to the first source, Yoma. Vahatan. So what we have here is, I'm going to read most of it in English. I just can't bring only English text even though I waste paper. Vahatanya, Be'esrim v'chamisha b'tevet, Yom Har Grizim Hu, Delo Lemispan. So the question is as follows. I want to make you aware. I'm just moving for a second. I'm coming right now. Megillat Talmud. Okay, this becomes a very important Megillah. Very few people know of it. It's not one of the tractates of Mishnah or Talmud. However, it was a Second Temple text by what we'll call the Prushim, right? Early rabbinic text. Basically, it's a series of 35 dates on which you did not fast and you did not eulogize. Hanukkah, of course, appears here, as does Purim. Many days we haven't heard of, and so on. But it gives us a little bit of an insight, certainly historically, as to some of the things they're commemorating. Much has to do with defeat of the Greeks, right? We got Antiochus out, Nicanor Day, we got Nicanor out, we got Antiochus out, and so on and so forth. Vered Noam did a masterful job of doing academic, scholarship on Megillat Ta'anit. It's considered to be the seminal work on Megillat Ta'anit. Again, a woman, a professor. She's really big in Daf Yomi right now. If anyone follows her, she has a wonderful class on Daf Yomi. She's Tila Leitzor's aunt. For those who know Tila Leitzor, who's a teacher here, and so really wonderful that we have, a relatively new work that has analyzed Megillat Ta'anit. Now, if it were only 35 dates, it wouldn't be this long. Each of the dates have added on what's called a scholia, text that was added on in later generations about the date stories and added information. And so she explains what's original, what's added later, and where it comes from. This line in Yoma is from Megillat Ta'anit. That's why I got to Megillat Ta'anit. Also, the idea of my Hanukkah, that line about the 25th of Kislev comes from Megillat Ta'anit. In other words, Chazal use Megillat Ta'anit. It is a text they're comfortable with. It's from within their own school, right? Their own Beit Midrash. And so we have this idea on the 25th of the Tevet is known as the day of Har Grizim. And now we're going to hear a story. Now, here's the complexity. The story could not have happened historically. It could not have happened historically because it's talking about the destruction of the Samaritan temple, which seems to have been built 200 years after Alexander the Great lived, right? Based on whatever evidence or whatever other sources we have. And Shimon HaTzadik could not have met Alexander the Great, and we're going to see Caligula, which is in another source. I mean, there are 400 years between Alexander and Caligula. In other words, there is a tradition in the Babylonian Talmud that fills in this date, but I would like to already, it's not about historical authenticity. In fact, I think all academics have said, no, this is not a historically accurate story, which then leads us to ask, why are we telling this story? And that I want to get to. And Benny Lau also asks and answers that question. So that's why choose these two to be the central characters in a story that probably happened, the destruction of the Samaritan temple, right? That's going to be the maybe the truth, the kernel in the story. But why bring these two in contact with one another? That's what we're going to talk about. Yeah, do you have a question? Good. Okay.
I have a question. When you talk about the Samaritan temple that's built after by Rishon?
After by Risha, yeah, no, it was built during by Cheney. From the quick look, I looked in Vera Nolan's book just before class because I didn't have it at home. It seems it was built 200 years. Alexander the Great lives around, I think, 300 BCE or 350 BCE. Again, around the time Shimon HaTzadik, we think he lived. That would be the end of the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah. That kind of lines up. But we also have Shimon HaTzadik living 400 years later. So again, I can't go into historical.
No.
Okay, let's take a look. Okay, you were just asking.
No, because to me, the Samaritan, I mean, that means that there's more than one Samaritan temple, but that's.
This Samaritan temple, there are questions. It's again,
No,
the academics debate about it, but it seems like it was built 200 years after Alexander the Great. Okay, so around 200 BCE. What occurred on that date? It was on that date that the Samaritans, the Kutim, requested the house of our Lord, their Lord, from which they believed in our God too. They believed in one God, from Alexander the Macedonian, in order to they requested our temple. Sorry, they wanted to destroy the Beit HaMikdash from Alexander the Macedonian in order to destroy it, and he gave it to them. Okay, so what we have here is a story in which a group of people external to us, external to the Jewish population, the Samaritans, who are in conflict with us, the Kutim, they come to Alexander the Great, the ruling leader of the world as we know it, and they ask for the Beit HaMikdash. People came and informed Shimon HaTzadik, who's the Kohen Gadol. What did he do? He put on priestly vestments, wrapped himself in the priestly vestments, which part of what's happening in Yoma is, are you allowed to wear bigdei kuna outside of the Mikdash? And they're like, normally no, but Shimon HaTzadik did it. Well, it was what we'll call shat hatkak. He didn't really have a choice. Okay. And the nobles of the Jewish people were with him with torches of fire in their hand. And all that night, the representatives of the Jewish people, right? You basically have two armies, well, the army of Hashem, to use Chabad's language, right? The army Shimon HaTzadik with his people holding torches, and you have the army of Alexander the Great coming towards one another. What does that remind us of, by the way? A little bit, maybe? The Egyptians and the Jews, the Bnei Israel, on right before Kriyat Yamsuf, there's something ominous. Right? There's something, where is this going to go? You have Hanukkah also, right? These small band of Jews with their high priest, and they're not warriors, they're not fighters, these are not the Hasmoneans, and they're coming with fire, right? The fire of Torah, the fire of truth, the fire of God, however you want to understand that. It's a great, and then you have they're approaching one another from opposite sides, also metaphorically very powerful, right? The opposite sides, you have the Greeks and the Jews, very different cultures and religious philosophies. When dawn arrived, Alexander said to the Shomronim, who are these people? They said to him, these are the Jews who rebelled against you. Remember, we told you about them. So this is obviously a theme we have with the Greeks, with the Romans. When he reached Antipatris, the sun shone, and the two camps met each other. When Alexander saw Shimon HaTzadik, this is a very moving moment, he descended from his chariot and bowed before him. His escort said, wait a minute, what are you doing? Should an important king such as you bow to this Jew? He said to them, I do this because I see this man's face before me when I go out and am victorious on the battlefield. So we have a little bit, right, of nebuah, maybe. He has this kind of nebuah, right? This is the face he sees, which plays on other areas, right? Yosef sees Yaakov's face before he, when he's in the house of Potiphar, which prevents him from sinning. This idea of seeing someone's face, right? Someone who actually, in this case, he's never met, who inspires him, who essentially announces his victory, is a great storytelling technique. It's great. It's memorable. We're going to remember it. And what happens is he says to the Jewish people, he says, look, I know this man. I've never met him, but I know him. He comes to me. He comes to me every time I go out to battle. What does that tell us, by the way? Who's ultimately behind Alexander's victories? God, right? He sees the Kohen Gadol, who is our conduit between Shammai and Barash. He's not going to see a representation of God. We don't believe God can be represented. Even Moshe couldn't see God, right? But he sees the Kohen Gadol wrapped in his white vestments, and that really is a sign that God is essentially assuring him victory. That's who Shimon HaTzadik is. He said, why have you come? He now says, after he's bowed before Shimon, why have you come? He said, well, is it possible the Mikdash in which we pray for you and for your kingdom not to be destroyed. The Gentiles here, the Kutim, will mislead you into destroying it. He said to them, who are these people? They said, the Shomronim who stand before you. And then he says, if so, they're delivered in your hands. It's the Purim story, right? Where Mihuzev, Ezehu, and then, well, it's Haman, right? Your buddy, your associate. So there are definitely threads from other stories that make their way in here. But it's a very powerful moment of meeting. And now the story is going to get a little bit bloody and violent, which we also like if we're going to tell stories. It reminds me a little of Maccabean, where also there's some very grotesque imagery of what happens. Immediately, they stabbed the Samaritans in their heels, hung them from their horses' tails, dragged them over the thorns and thistles until they reached Har Gerizim. When they arrived at Har Gerizim, they plowed over the temple and seeded the area with leeks. Again, great detail, lots of great details in this story. And this is what they had wanted to do to the Beit HaMikdash, and they made that day a festival. Right? So it's a fantastic story. It's definitely a memorable story. And if I peel it back, it really is a story that is about the meeting between these two, I would say, powers, right? Two leading ideologies of mankind: man-centered, God-centered. But then we discovered that Alexander is a little God-centered also, right? Because he recognizes that this person coming to him is some sort of divine prophecy that he's going to be victorious. So the victory over the Greeks is heightened in many ways, right? Not only do we save our temple, save the day, like we did in the Purim story, but it's the Kohen Gadol representing godliness, representing white and fire, and God's protection of us extends to his protection of Alexander the Great, and so on and so forth. And so really, it's a fantastic story, and it's very deliberate. Again, regardless of what happened, when and where. It does seem like the Samaritans' temple was destroyed at some point. It's possible the Jews were involved in that. That's not the point of the story. The point of the story is you have these two powers meeting, and Shimon HaTzadik brings godliness to Alexander the Great. That's the point of the story. That's the greatness of the story. That the light and the fire of Torah, of Judaism, prevails over the pervasive culture of the Greeks, which is very man-centered. And Greek culture, make no mistake, and we're going to see this in other stories as well, Greek culture is pervasive in rabbinic literature, meaning we see elements, Greek language makes its way into rabbinic stories, shadows or hints to Greek stories that are rewritten and reworked. We'll see one of them today, a retelling of the Narcissus story. And so there is tremendous influence. We know Jews Hellenize. And so this story becomes an important moment, like I said, where Shimon HaTzadik, the Kohen Gadol, the Tzaddik, right, essentially is stronger and greater and essentially is the source of inspiration for Alexander. Okay, comments, questions? I think a very beautiful story, regardless of what happened in that moment. And that the idea of Har Gerizim, right? This idea that we have a date where we remember this salvation is what the Gemara is trying to say. That's what Har Gerizim must be about, right? This story we're telling about the overpowering of the Shomronim, thanks to the meeting of Alexander and Shimon HaTzadik. And by the way, by the time the Bavli is writing this, they're not keeping Har Gerizim Day. Now, most of the dates in Megillat Ta'anit are not observed by the time we get to the Bavli. In other words, once your temple's been destroyed, you're not really going back and remembering dates about salvation in the aftermath of such destruction. Hanukkah and Purim make the cut, but you don't really need another story about the victory over the spiritual victory over the Greeks. We do that in Hanukkah. So a lot of that. Okay. Comments, questions? I'm going to go on to the next story. Okay. Let's take a look at the next. Here is a story with Caligula. As I said, Caligula lives 400 years after Alexander the Great. They're certainly fluent and aware of history, right, and of the personalities like Alexander and Caligula who have influence on their life. There was another incident. V'shuv ma'aseh b'Shimon HaTzadik. I'll read this because it's a short text in the Hebrew. I'm on page 2, the middle source, Sota 33. Sheshama bat kol mi beit kodesh hakodashim shehu omer b'teilat avidita. Da'amar sana, oh, it's actually in Aramaic. Da'amar sana la'aita al hechala v'ne'arag gas kalgas uvatlu gezerotav v'katvu tasha'a v'kibnu u'v'lashon arami hayamer. So what happens here? Shimon HaTzadik hears a bat call from the Kodesh Kodashim. Remember, he's a Kohen Gadol. So he can only go into the Kodesh Kodashim once a year on Yom Kippur, but he hears the bat call because he can be in the area outside of the Kodesh Kodashim. saying the decree of the enemy intended to bring against the temple is annulled. Gas Kalgas, which is Caligula, has been killed. His decrees have been voided. Here's another story where Shimon HaTzadik hears about divine salvation, averting the terrible decree of destroying the temple. We all know by the time we're reading this text, the temple has been destroyed. But Shimon HaTzadik seems to be, again, end of Anshe Knesset HaGadola, end of the period of prophecy. Bayit Sheni, beginning of the period of the transition towards post-temple life, is very much holding the miraculous salvation that almost on a daily level is happening during Bayit Sheni, right? It's the Greeks and ultimately then it's going to be the Romans. But here, Caligula has been killed, decrees have been voided. People wrote this down and they found it matched the exact moment Caligula was killed when the divine voice was speaking in Aramaic, which shows the divine voice, of course, can speak in any language, the divine voice, which is to speak it, right? But the Aramaic certainly reinforces the primacy of Aramaic in the Talmud, right? This idea that if God speaks Aramaic, then it's okay for us to be teaching Torah in Aramaic. Right? That's what comes up for me. Okay, comments, questions before we look at, yes, the next story I've taught before. Some of you have heard me teach it before. It's really one of my favorite stories, a very inspiring story. Let's take a look at Nidarim 9b. Okay, this story appears in a few places. Just to remind you, the Narcissus story, right? What happens to Narcissus? Sometimes I bring that text. We often learn it in elementary school when there's literature, English classes bring some Greek mythology. So what we have with Narcissus is he is a beautiful young man who is impervious to the love showered on him by men and women alike. So much so that he ends up like callously disregarding the love of Echo. And that's why Echo, forever after, you hear her voice echoing because she becomes a shadow of herself and so on, because of Narcissus's callous indifference to her feelings. And so what ends up happening is he comes across a pool of water. And for the first time, he sees himself. And essentially, he falls in love with himself. And he makes love to his reflection. And he just sits there enraptured, enamored. And ultimately, he dies because he neither eats nor drinks. And ultimately, he dies out of love for himself. That's where we get the idea of someone who's a narcissist, right? We take that from the story of Narcissus. Self-love, destructive self-love. Not self-confidence, not, oh, yes, I look in the mirror in order to say, I'm going to be a good person today. I'm going to be a strong person. I'm an attractive person, whatever we do to give ourselves confidence. This is destructive self-love. So that's the story of Narcissus. So I want to show how it plays out, a reworking in the rabbinic story. It really is an excellent example of how they seem to know the story of Narcissus and they're going to use it, but in a direction that's going to be about a valuable lesson for us and how to avoid being a narcissist. Okay. Titania, Amar Rabbi Shimon HaTzadik. Niamai lo akalti ashan nazir tameh me ala achad. So the ashan nazir tameh is really an offering that the nazir brings when he becomes tameh and has to restart his nizirut. Okay, and in order to fully unpack this sentence, let me say something about Nizirim in the time of Bayit Sheni. They were, how do you say, cheap and easy to come by? In other words, the Nazir in the Torah is clearly meant to be a very drastic move taken by someone. It's not meant to be casual. It's not meant to be a showpiece for my piety, right? It's meant, you're actually meant to be, dissuaded a little bit, right? You have to let your hair grow wild and be unkempt and untended to. You can't drink any grape products, which at the time would have been a big deal. Imagine telling a French person no grape products, and specifically wine, for a month, right? There are cultures where wine is the drink that they drink. In the time of the Bayit Sheni, certainly wine would have been a drink much more than water, right? So it's a big sacrifice. And then you can't go near the dead like a Kohen. But if you're not a Kohen, there's death tuma everywhere. And it's meant to restrict you. It's meant to restrain you. It's meant to discipline you. It's an act you take to try to recover from something. Chazal claim from seeing a sota. I think that's a little, that's the juxtaposition of the parshiot, but really you're meant to do something somewhat drastic, act a little bit like a Kohen, but in an unkempt, untended kind of way, something a little wild and unrestrained to become more restrained. That's the Nazir in the Torah. In the time of the Second Temple, people are abusing the idea of Nazir. And so people are, oh yeah, I'm a Nazir. How about you? Yeah, why don't we all become Nazirs? Yeah, let's do a month and kind of like a cleanse. Let's all cleanse. Let's all go to Nazirut, right? And it involves, of course, coming to the temple and bringing sacrifices and shaving all your hair. And it's very prominent. If you're a Nazir, people know you're a Nazir. Not only that, you need to be somewhat wealthy to be a Nazir. In other words, you have to bring a sheep. You have to bring like a real animal at the end of Nazirut. And so there's something a little showy and ostentatious about it if you're using it the wrong way, right? And so Shimon HaTzadik says a lot in saying, I only ate, not only has he, it seems he's never eaten the Nazir offering, he's never eaten the Asham Nazir Tameh, which are the people who constantly get Tameh, right? In the middle, you're supposed to stay away from Tumah, and then Tameh, now I've got to start again. So now I really have to let everyone know, oh my God, I've got to start again. I have to like bring a korban. Oh my God, this is so hard, right? Like you can imagine, and we just have to use social media today to know what this would look like on TikTok and Twitter and so on. Oh yeah, I took Nazirut today. Oh my God, fell off the wagon, got to get back on. You can only imagine pictures with me half shaven, fully shaven, and so on. And that's what's happening. And it's happening at a time where there's a corrupt priesthood, right? It makes sense. A corrupt priesthood that has become fat and satiated and rich and like, with gold and with money and with wealth. And so it makes sense the Nazirut will be abused. And Shimon HaTzadik says, I actually only ate a Nazir offering once in my life, which is a big deal because the Kohanim get their food and their nourishment from these voluntary offerings. Nidavas are much easier to bring home to your family than Konchim. Konchim, you can't, you're somewhat limited. They can't leave the Harabai, but on the Dava, I have more room. And so let's find out whose offering he ate. Only once. Did he ever meet a Nazir that he felt was authentic? And this is the story. Hamachad, so again, once upon a time, that's how we know we're in a story. Ba'adam achad Nazir min hadaram, uritiv shuhu yafe inayim v'tov ro'i ukvutzotav sturot lo taltavim. I'm on the bottom of page 2, Nedarim 9b. So what we have here, once upon a time, a man came and he was a Nazir from the south. Now I'm already going to say in many stories, the south is like a wilderness of kind of Torah illiteracy. And the fact that he's from the south already says, I often use this story to show we judge people. We always do by how they look and where they're from. We just do. Oh, you're from New York? Oh, okay. I know where you're from, right? As opposed to you're from Minnesota. Oh, small town. Know what that's about, right? So we often, we judge people, geography and the way they look. So we now find out this man is from the south. He's a shepherd. We're going to find out in a moment. I'll already preempt this in a moment. Shepherds are not a profession to be admired. Unlike in the Tanakh, right? The shepherd, in fact, Chazal say they shouldn't really be witnesses because they're prone to let their flocks graze untended on other people's property, right? And so we're going to find this young man is a shepherd from the south. I jumped ahead of myself a little bit. Okay. And he's very beautiful. So that also makes us a little bit suspicious, right? Someone who's so beautiful, right? They very shallow, very entitled, very pretentious, and he's from the south. Like a lot of emptiness in there, right? A lot of rekanut. He doesn't say that, but it's clear he's already penned this person as this kind of beautiful, empty-headed person. And look how he yafeh inayim, these beautiful eyes, attractive, beautiful hair. Dionysian type hair, locks neatly arranged, right? Very Grecian in the description. Amartilo, and this man is coming to essentially shave his head because he's bringing the Nazir offering, the Nazir, the Asham Nazir Tameh, which means he's going to have to shave his head now and then shave his head at the end of the full Nazir, right? And so we're already very suspicious, like, this guy can't be for real, and he's going to shave his head. And look what Shimon HaTzadik says. He says, oh my God, why are you going to destroy that hair? Notice that what catches his eye is this beauty that is about to be destroyed. And he actually protests, which surprises us a little bit. Again, we're not immune to beauty. And his, kind of, what's the point? Why destroy that hair? You're an empty Nazir. Like, what's the point? Like, oh my God, you're going to destroy that hair. And for what? And it pains me that you're going to destroy that hair. It's so beautiful. Okay. So what happens next? Amarli. And now the young man is going to speak. Roeh hayiti la'aba bi'iri. I was a shepherd to my father in town. Halachti, again, so we have, first of all, the father's side. I don't know what to do with that, but not all the versions have him as a shepherd to his father. Halachti l'malot mayim mina ma'ayan, v'nistakalti babavua sheli. So he goes to fill up water and he sees his reflection. And we're meant to understand for the first time. Okay, that's the only way to understand. Like Narcissus, he comes upon his reflection, and we've already been told by Shimon that he is really beautiful, right? And he sees himself in the water. And the question is, how do you respond to a moment it can never be taken back? You can never unknow what he's about to see, and it has the power to change his entire life, right? It's that moment of self-discovery that he is really beautiful. And beauty comes with entitlement, especially in the Greek period of time, right? Entitlement and privilege and so on. And he has this moment where he looks in the reflection, and look what he says. Ufachaz alai yitzri, uvikesh v'tordeni minho. And my yetzer rose up and sought to distract me from his will, right? Which again, is a little old-fashioned in the language, but what I'm reading from this is I can't unknow this. And now my whole life can be about my beauty, meaning it's going to obsess me. It's going to distract me. It's going to be all about how beautiful I am. Like, this is it. Like, I can't unknow this moment. And this is terrifying, because to be this beautiful comes with an enormous responsibility or enormous opportunity, right? I can now leave my job as a shepherd, go out to the big city, and I'll find sponsors and mentors. Doors will open. I'll be able to hobnob with the elite, especially among the Greeks, right? A beautiful young man. I don't even have to tell you what's going to happen, right? He could become really go very high up in society, become very, very wealthy based on his beauty. He says, "Look, Tordani, my Yetzer started telling me all the things I can do with this, and it will distract me from the world that I know, from the person that I thought I was." So what does he say? Amartilo, I said to my Yetzer. I love this because it's so, self-help books are all about talking to yourself, right? Russia, wicked one. He doesn't give him a moment. Lama atam mitka'eh ba'olam she'eno shalcha, b'mishu atid liot rima v'tolea, ha'avodah she'agalchalcha l'shamayim. He says something, it's so profound. He basically says to his Yetzer, you're wicked. This doesn't belong to me. This beauty, and eventually I'm going to die and it's going to rot. This is temporary. This is finite. Right? By God's word, I'm going to shave it off for the sake of heaven. I'm going to become a Nazir. That's the moment. So again, notice the contrast with Narcissus, who essentially ruins his life. Meaning he's already not a particularly nice person, but once he catches sight of his reflection, he can't. He literally dies. He leaves the world because it has so distracted him. Here, the Nazir, this young man, this young shepherd says, that is not going to happen to me. And I'm going to have to do something very extreme in order to avoid this happening to me, because I can no longer unknow that I'm beautiful. I am beautiful. But what I have to remind myself consistently is beauty is finite, that ultimately this doesn't belong to me. My beauty belongs to God, meaning I get no credit for this, right? And he's going to have to do something drastic. Before we continue on, I'll just say his hair will grow back. In other words, I think part of what's happening here is he needs to do something drastic in order to learn to live with who he is. In other words, he cannot escape the fact he's not disfiguring himself. He doesn't take a knife and start cutting himself. He doesn't put a bag over his head. He is beautiful. He will not be able to escape that reality. But what he says in that moment, I have to remind myself this is not mine. And the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to offer up a piece of my beauty to God, so that when it grows back again, I will always remember that moment of sacrifice, that moment in which I acknowledge my beauty came from God. And that's what will guide me. Right. So what happens next? So there's so much self-growth and discovery here, right? Like we should, and it's a deliberate reworking of Narcissus, because this man could have been that and immediately says no. And that's the power of Bechira Chofshei, of course. That's the power of will that God has given us, that we have these moments that challenge us. And we really have the opportunity to choose differently every time. Miyad amaditi. So what does Shimon HaTzadik say when he hears this? I kissed him on the head, the hair that's about to be shorn. It's very intimate and it's very beautiful. Amarti lo b'ni kamocha yirbu nozrei niziru b'Yisrael. Halavai. This should be what the Nazir was about. Like you, there should be many Nazirim. Alecha hakatuv omer ish ki afli lindor neder nazir lahazir ladonai. You embody the pasuk. I have never met a Nazir, says Shimon HaTzadik, who's met many Nazirs. They're all around. They're floating all around, right? Chazal actually protested different. Stop being, don't be such a Nazir, right? Don't take this so casually. If they were all like you, that you understood the power of the metaphor in the Nazirut, the power of the action, the ability to go through a transformation of self-growth and self-discovery by withdrawing, by sacrificing. Halavai, that's what it should be. And he kisses him and so on. And so it's actually a beautiful story. It's retold in several places in Chazal. And again, Shimon HaTzadik recognizes tzidkut and changes his mind, of course, about this young man. Because when we first started the story, Shimon HaTzadik was seduced by his beauty also. That's all he saw. Oh my God, you're going to destroy that hair? You're Shimon HaTzadik. Even the tzaddik has the power to be derailed and distracted by beauty. And he listens to the young man. That's you can use this in so many ways, right? How do we really listen once we've already made our assumptions or judged someone or made our preconception, right? He listens to him and he recognizes, wow, this is La Hashem. This is what it means to be a Nazir La Hashem. And so Shimon HaTzadik is definitely the right person to be receiving this. It tells us a lot about the period of time in which he's living. It also tells us that even at tzaddik, right, it has to not be nitra. Right? The man said, "Yetzer nisa hatridani min haolam." Shimon HaTzadik was tarud from his beauty. So Allah hakama v'kama. How much more so this young Nazir? And really, the lessons learned, I think, affect and inspire us. And I go back to this story a lot. This is a story I find very powerful. I teach it a lot, but I try to also use it for myself, right? What do we see when we look in the mirror, right? What distracts us? How do we use what we see in order to grow more deeply and more fully? Yeah, someone questions.
In English, it uses the man or woman.
Yes, a Nazir could be a man or a woman.
Right. We know of examples of women.
Women who were in Nazirot. So Nesechet Nazir, which we're going to be doing right now, Daf Yomi is finishing Ketubot today, starting the Darim tomorrow, and the next tractate I think is Nazir, although maybe Sotek comes in between. They do know of women who are Nazirs, absolutely, and I can't remember any stories, although it could be when I finish the Masechet, there will be some. The difference between a man and a woman is a husband can say he doesn't want his wife to be a Nazir because she shaves her head. I don't want a woman, a bald wife, even though it's only for a month. Remember, that's going to be a pretty big deterrent for women. It is true women seem to have covered their heads with something, but they weren't satmar. You weren't wearing wigs. You were wearing some sort of head covering where your hair was actually, it like fell around your face. So a man could say, I don't want an ugly wife. That's what he can say, which again is very interesting today. So I don't know of any stories where a woman is a Nazir that I can remember, but my guess is there are some, and they'll be in the tractate. Single women can certainly take Nazirut upon a widow, a divorcee, a woman who doesn't have a husband or a father, if she's a young girl who has a degree of power over her decision making. If she's a woman unencumbered by a man, then she certainly could take a Nazir. It says, the Torah even says, it's one of the few places where the Torah says, Isha, Isha.
Yeah.
You don't have it a lot. Usually it's in the masculine. Yeah, good question. Someone else? Okay. I think we're gonna have time to get through another story, this is the last one on Shimon HaTzadik, the Tosefta. And let's take a look at this. And I hope as you read it, it will remind you of a midrash that appears in Sefer Bereshit. Tell me what you think. Kolzman Shayash, and anyone online have something they want to ask before I move to the last story about Shimon? If not, I'll move on. I know you're there. Thank you. Kolzman Shayash Shimon HaTzadik Kayam, Haytan Ner Ma'aravi Tadir, Mishamed Halchu Umetza'u Shekiba. So as long as he was alive, the Ner Ma'aravi was permanently lit. It's the light that when we talk about differences in Bayit Rishon, Bayit Sheni, the Ner Ma'aravi is one of those. It was like a Ner Tamid, right? And when he died, they found it extinguished. And what happened after that? Mikan ve'elech motzi'in oto pa'amim kabeh Pamim dole. Sometimes it's lit, sometimes it's extinguished. It's a magic light, if you will, like reminding us of Hanukkah. Sometimes they would find it lit, sometimes it's extinguished. They had very little control over it. Okay. כל זמן שהיה שמעון הצדיק קיים, הייתה מערכה תדירה, כשמסדרים אותה בשחרית, הייתה מתגברת והולכת כל היום כולו, והיו מקריבים עליה תמידין ומוספים בנסחיהם, ולא היו מוסיפים עליה אלא 2 גזרי עצים, עם תמיד של בין הארבעים, כדי לקיים מצוות עצים, שנאמר, ובער לה הכהן. So here's another amazing thing. The fire on the Mizbeach was perpetual. They would arrange it in the morning. They would add 2 loads of wood with the Ben Harabayim, the Tamid, towards the end of the day, because we know from a pasuk you had to like actively keep the fire going, but they didn't need more wood than that, right? Again, it was I mean, on one hand a miracle, on the other hand also possible, right? But it was regular, right? They never ran out. The fire never ran out except for these 2 gizrei etzim. Okay, made resources much extended further, manpower. Also, okay. Mishamei tzivon atzadik tashash kochol shel ma'aracha shemisadrin oto b'shacharit lo hayu nimna'im le'osif aleh etzim kol hayom kulo. When he died, they were constantly having to feed the fire. They had to add wood to it all day long. Kol zman shaya Shimon atzadik kayam birkat nichneset b'shtei alecha ובלחם הפנים, שתי הלחם מתחלקת בעצרת לכהנים, ולחם הפנים ברגל לכל המשמרות. So also there was this unbelievable power to the lechem hapanim and the shtei halechem. The shtei halechem are given out on Shavuot to the priests, and the lechem hapanim on every one of the regalim. And what happened here is, hold on a second, the Kol Mishmarot. Yesh me'an she'ochlim b'sovin, v'yesh she'ochlim u'motrin, v'lo ala b'yad kol achad ve'achad ela kazayit. A kazayit was enough to feed each Kohen, right? He would eat a kazayit and be satiated. Sounds a little like man, right? This like kind of magical bread. And some of them would even leave it over. It doesn't matter. They were all satiated. Once he died, Mishamei Shimon HaTzadik, lo hayta bracha nichneset, lo b'shtei halechem v'lo b'lechem hapanim. And what would happen is after he died, there's no longer this blessing, and the Tsanua priests didn't end up getting really any, because the gargaranim, I love that word, the gluttons divided it up amongst themselves, and they each got like a little bean, not a kazayit, and like it seems like the Tsunuim didn't even really get, and there's lacking, there's want, right? מעשה בכהן אחד מציפורי שנטל חלקו וחלק חברו ואף על פי כן לא עלה בידו אלא כפול והיו קוראים אותו בן חמסן עד היום. And so here then there was a story that one of them reached in from Tzipori and he took his portion and he shared, and even then they each only got a little beans worth, and they called him Chamsan, which is not a very nice word. It seemed to me he was doing something nice, but maybe not. Okay. Shana Shemei Shimon HaTzadik Amar Lahem B'Shana Zo Ani. So here now we're at the very end, his death. First of all, what did that remind you of? The fact that the fire went out, the bread wasn't. Sorry, Mina, right? Sarah. There at least Rivka comes in and right and continues it. What we're seeing here is the end of the temple period, right? Really, there's no one who's going to come and reignite the fire in the way that Shimon did. There's a gradual decline. But it reminds us, right, that certain people have the power to keep the fire going continuously, and we're going to have to look for replacements after. So what happens when he dies? Shana shemet ba Shimon HaTzadik amar lahem b'shana zo ani met amar lo minayin ata yodea amar lahem. How do you know? How do you know you're going to die this year? Amar lahem kol yom. I love this story. Kol yomot haKippurin haya zaken echad lovesh begadim levanim umitkaseh levanim nichnasimi v'yotzeimi. Every year when I would go into the Kodesh Kodeshim, he was a high priest, it seems, for 40 years, there was an old man who would come with me, right, wearing white. Which again, we can add, who do we think the old man is in his white clothes? What? Who did you say? Could be God, a manifestation of God. Eliyahu, Moshe, Aaron. Hey, Aaron, right? It ties us back to the Alexander story, right? Alexander sees Shimon HaTzadik. Shimon HaTzadik sees an older man dressed in white. I would even be very modern and say maybe even himself, right? Right, it's himself. He goes in with the best of himself, his soul, his neshama. Right? He sees an old man in white. He's also an old man in white, right? So he sees his zaken, or maybe who he is at the end of his life. and comes in and he goes out with me. And so I know that my avoda is successful, and he gives me confidence and security and assurity. Shana zo nichnasi mi v'lo yatsa. He came in with me, but he didn't go out. Achar haregel chala shivat yamim. He became sick for 7 days, also a powerful number. Umet mishemet Shimon HaTzadik pasku mevavarech b'shem. So I'm not sure. I don't think that. What did they begin on? They no longer the blessing in the name of Hashem. But we do say that Yud Gimel Midot. I don't know which. I don't have Rashi here, so I don't know what the name of Hashem is. But something stops at that point. Maybe using you know how we all say on Yom Kippur, and they would say the ineffable name of Hashem. I think that's it. That's when it stops, right? They no longer say that ineffable name that we don't say, right? That we allude to. That's what stops, right? So his death ends that part of the ritual. Something significant happens when he dies. I even like the fact that he's sick for 7 days is portentous, right? This idea that 7 days it's a full week. It includes a Shabbat, 7 days of creation. He has that transition out of this world, and then he dies, and the name Shem Hashem is no longer said. That's mostly what it is, the Shem Hashem Avoda. And so really, as I said, just to wrap things up, throughout the stories, we see a tzidkut, we see someone who really is holding on to this world of, he represents the Torah, Avoda, Gemilut, Chasadim paradigm, right? He's holding all three. But he recognizes the avoda is going to shift. As someone said, it's no longer going to be the avoda of the korbanot, not with Shem Hashem, not with the ner tamid burning throughout. Right, things are beginning to decline, and we have to hold it up with these 3 pillars, but shifted slightly differently, invested differently, and really, I think an important personality that illuminates for us what is beginning to happen and where we're going to be going. Comments, questions. So that's really the end of Shimon HaTzadik. Yes, in every way, he has passed away, and we are ending with him.
Most of these places that you read from were probably written after he died.
Hundreds of years after he died. Hundreds of years.
But there was and they're in the Babylonian Talmud.
Yeah.
There was a long
period.
long-lived tradition of who he was.
Yes. He remains. That's why, again, what I love here is we know of him from Pirkei Avot mostly, but when you collate the stories, and that's why I'm very appreciative to Rav Benny for allowing me to see a concentration of stories about someone who we know of, we've heard his name, but this just fleshed out so much more what his personality and how they're remembering him. Right. So it's what I said in the beginning. It's not about historical truth. It's about the presence of a man, the memory of a man, and what he represented for them, even hundreds of years later, how he became a very important moment in this transition from prophecy, Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, into the end of Bayit and Chazal, into Mishnah Talmud, and they hold him very dear and very tight. Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to stop here. I'm not going to start with Hanina Ben Dosa. More or less, is this too fast? Were people okay? I think I tried to say, right, good. So this is what we're going to be doing. I think it's fun. I think these are stories you really can be inspired. It's about learning and history and inspiration. Thank you very much, ladies. Ladies of the view. Ladies of the screen. Ladies of the Zoom. Yeah. Oh, I like that. Yeah. Ladies of the Zoom. Good. Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello?
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. You're welcome.